A 5-year-old boy vanishes without a trace in broad daylight at a shopping mall. 13 years later, his mother receives a midnight phone call that leaves her paralyzed. "Mom, I think I'm Benjamin." It was a sweltering June afternoon in 1998 when 5-year-old Benjamin Walker entered the Garden Mall in Ohio with his mother. Laura held her son's hand as they walked through the main concourse, letting go only when they approached the electronics section on the ground floor. She left him at the free play area where an Atari 2600 game console was set up for demo play, while she took a few steps over to the checkout counter to buy an electrical plug. 3 minutes later, Benjamin was gone. No one saw him leave. No one saw anyone take him. There was no scream, no signs of a struggle, no strange sounds. The boy had simply vanished in broad daylight, inside a brightly lit, crowded shopping mall. When Laura returned to the game console, she assumed her son was still engrossed in a game that hadn't finished. But the screen was still on, and no one was standing near it. The other kids had wandered off. Only a few adults were chatting at the far end of the department. She glanced around, rising onto her toes, calling softly at first, then louder. "Ben, where are you?" No answer. At first, she walked around the area, thinking he might be playing hide-and-seek or had ducked into a corner like kids often do. But after checking every aisle of toys and seeing nothing but cardboard boxes and stuffed animals, panic began to rise. She went to a nearby employee and asked if they had seen a young boy, blue shirt, grey shorts, light brown hair standing there a moment ago. The employee hesitated, then shook their head. Another staff member called security. When a young clerk mentioned he might have seen an adult carrying a child running toward the West emergency exit, Laura didn't hesitate. She took off in that direction. The steel door to the exit was slightly ajar, hot, dry sunlight pouring through. She stepped outside, scanning the parking lot, but all she saw was silent, still vehicles. Nothing suspicious. No engines running, no one hurrying away. Security rewound the surveillance footage. They played it back repeatedly, but found nothing unusual. Stranger still, the camera positioned near the play area, the one that should have captured Benjamin's exit, had been out of order since the day before. The technician hadn't gotten around to fixing it yet. A coincidence no one could explain. Or perhaps didn't want to. Police arrived 20 minutes later and immediately sealed off all mall exits, alerted the stores in the area, and began checking every nook and cranny. The boy's name, age, and a description of his clothing were broadcast over the mall's internal system. A young officer took Laura to the security office for a detailed statement. She answered every question. Her son's name was Benjamin Walker, born in 1993, about 3 feet tall, brown hair, dark brown eyes, and on his left hand, he still had a sticker of a school bus he'd gotten that morning at the pediatric clinic. The officer continued questioning. "What time was the last time you saw the boy?" Laura answered, 3:10. He wrote it down, then asked, "Was there anyone suspicious around? Anyone who might have been watching you two?" She shook her head. Everything had seemed completely normal. The security guard reminded Laura she shouldn't have left a young child alone, but said nothing more when he noticed her hands beginning to tremble and her face draining of color. Another employee brought her a glass of cold water and placed it in front of her, but she didn't touch it. Michael, Laura's ex-husband, arrived a little before 4. When he came in, Laura was sitting with her head down, staring at the tiled floor. She didn't speak, and he didn't ask anything. Michael simply placed a hand on her shoulder and sat beside her in silence. A police officer, recognizing them as the boys' parents, approached and informed them that patrol units had been deployed around Garden Mall and that the parking area was being carefully checked, vehicle by vehicle. The sun began to set. The mall continued to operate as usual. Families kept shopping, Other children still laughed and played. No one outside the security zone had any idea that a child had just vanished in the time it takes to pay for a purchase. Laura returned home a little after 7 p.m., alone. The apartment was quiet. She turned on the light in Benjamin's room, stepped inside, and sat on her son's bed. The dinosaur print pillow was still slightly indented in the center, as if he'd just been lying there that afternoon. On the desk was a tray of unfinished toys. A small plastic car flipped on its back. Laura picked up the stuffed cat, Muffin, from the floor and held it tightly against her chest. There were no tears, only emptiness and the steady hum of the ceiling fan overhead. Her world had lost a familiar sound, the voice calling, "Mommy, I'm done," the light patter of small feet, the giggling that came when he begged for more candy. Outside the window, the streetlights gradually flickered on. Another day came to an end, like any other. But for Laura, time had stopped at exactly 3:13 p.m. She couldn't sleep that night. She just sat there, clutching the stuffed animal, repeating one sentence over and over. I only looked away for 3 minutes. 3 minutes. Just enough time for a mother to lose her child. The next morning, when Laura came downstairs in her apartment building to open the door for an investigator, the hallway was already filled with eyes, some familiar, some not all watching her with a kind of silence that didn't feel normal. The neighbor from the floor below gave her a small nod as she walked by, but didn't smile like he usually did. Someone passing whispered, "That's the mother of the missing boy from yesterday." The news had spread faster than she'd expected. The local paper had it on the front page. 5-year-old boy disappears at Garden Mall. Police expand investigation. A photo of Benjamin taken from an album Laura had submitted with his preschool application appeared on the TV screen morning and night, along with a hotline number and a plea. If anyone sees the boy, call immediately. Not even 24 hours after he vanished, flyers with Benjamin's photo were taped to lamp posts, stuck on grocery store windows, even handed out by strangers at busy intersections. Volunteer groups mobilized quickly. Police expanded their search outward in a circle from the shopping center. Local search teams combed drainage ditches, empty lots, and the riverbanks nearby. Helicopters made brief passes overhead, circling the residential area and the wooded outskirts of town. All that noise, all those people, but no news, no clues, no personal items. No one could remember seeing the boy after 3:13 p.m. For the first 3 days, Laura moved through life numb. She gave interviews, read from statements the police had written out for her, repeated descriptions of Benjamin so many times it felt automatic. She slept on the living room couch, didn't change her clothes, and left the TV on around the clock. Every time the phone rang, her heart stopped for a second, but almost every call was a reporter or someone who had dialed the wrong number. Michael showed up again on the second day. He was an hour late to the press conference organized by the police. No one asked why he hadn't been there from the beginning. When the cameras panned across, Laura and Michael stood side by side, but they didn't touch. In front of dozens of microphones and lenses, she read the plea aloud, her voice barely rising above the soft June wind. If someone out there has my child, please bring him back. He's too little to understand what's going on. He needs to eat, to be held when he sleeps. Benjamin is a good boy. I'm begging you, please. Her voice dropped on the last 2 words. Michael remained still beside her, his face unreadable. But right after the press conference, once they were back in the police meeting room, the two of them erupted. He snapped at her. "Why did you leave him alone?" "In a shopping mall," she answered. "It wasn't the first time he stood there by himself. I turned away for just 3 minutes. His voice tightened. 3 minutes is more than enough for a kidnapper. Laura turned away, trying to steady her breath. She didn't say she had imagined this moment 1,000 times in her head, Benjamin suddenly returning, and her throwing her arms around him. But the reality was just another worn-out argument. Michael stormed out of the meeting, pushing the door hard. She watched him go without calling after him. They no longer knew how to share their pain. On the 5th day, police announced a small lead. From a camera in the parking lot, about 30 meters from the west emergency exit, footage showed a grey pickup truck leaving at 3:16 p.m., the exact time Benjamin was reported missing. But the camera was old, the footage blurry, and the license plate only revealed the first 3 characters, LZC. No one could determine who owned the vehicle, and the Garden Mall saw more than 200 cars come and go every day. A fragile lead. No one dared call it a clue. On local forums, the comments had begun, "A 5-year-old left alone. Why wasn't the mother watching him more closely? There's something off about the way she reacts." Laura read those words late at night. She hadn't slept in 24 hours. She closed the laptop, turned off all the lights, and sat alone in the dark. Her mother-in-law, Michael's mother, called on Saturday, just to say one sentence. "If you knew how to be a mother, that boy would be home by now." The words cut deep. Not because of the accusation, but because they echoed what Laura had already told herself 100 times since Benjamin disappeared. Since that day, she hadn't answered any calls from unknown numbers. She turned down every new interview request, avoided crowded places. Inside the apartment, Laura moved only between the living room and her son's bedroom, where everything remained untouched. Muffin, the stuffed cat, still lay on the pillow. The little desk still held the coloring book Benjamin hadn't finished. On the evening of the 10th day, a group of volunteers came to the door. They handed Laura a map of the suburbs and invited her to join the search the next morning. Laura took the map, closed the door without a word. That night, she folded the map into quarters, slid it into the kitchen drawer, then turned on the stove to boil water. In that brief moment, between the low bubbling and the soft yellow light, Laura looked toward the kitchen wall, where a picture Benjamin had drawn 2 months earlier still hung. Below, the stick figures in wobbly handwriting, it said, "Mom is a superhero." She broke down, crying, no sound, no witness. Only the hiss of water spilling from the kettle and the sharp sting that wouldn't leave her eyes. As the days passed, time no longer brought hope, only silence, exhaustion, and one unrelenting question. Where had Benjamin gone? A year after Benjamin disappeared, Laura was still living in the same old apartment on the corner of 42nd Street. The neighborhood had changed, some families had moved away, a few stores had shut down. Even the police officer who once handled her son's case had been reassigned to another district, but Laura remained, along with Benjamin's small bed and the faint scent of baby powder still clinging to his thin blanket. She worked the night shift at a print shop from 9 p.m. until nearly dawn. The job was monotonous, but it spared her from having to make small talk or endure the hollow condolences, the pitying looks, or worse, the doubtful ones from people she used to know. In the mornings, before heading home, she'd stop by the little coffee stand at the mouth of the alley, buy a cup of black coffee with no sugar, then walk another 15 minutes to stand once more in front of the Garden Mall, the last known place her son had been seen. No one paused at the Garden Mall anymore to remember what had happened there. The old flyers were long gone. New grey tiles had been laid over the sidewalk, erasing the wear of time, and the Sears store had closed down the previous winter. But Laura still stood there, eyes fixed on the third-floor parking deck, as if any minute now her little boy might appear from behind a car, walk down the ramp, and tell her he had just gotten a little lost, There was a time a boy about Benjamin's age, wearing a blue shirt and white sneakers, just like he used to run past her in the mall. She flinched, took a few steps after him, and called out softly, "Ben." But when he turned around, the eyes weren't her son's. The man walking beside him frowned and asked, "What do you think you're doing, lady?" Laura didn't answer. She simply bowed her head, apologized, and walked away. Laura no longer had custody of Emily, her youngest daughter, since the court had ruled she was not mentally stable enough to ensure the safety of a minor. Michael and his mother had filed for custody, citing the times Laura skipped meals, failed to pick Emily up from school on time, and the 3 separate incidents where she left the stove on. The hearing was brief, with just a few lines of conclusion. Emily was sent to live with her grandmother. Laura didn't argue. She only asked one thing: "May I see my child once a month?" And when he nodded, she gave a faint smile. Every year on June 12th, she still held a birthday party for Benjamin, even though no one came anymore. In the beginning, neighbors, a few friends from her old job, even a reporter who had once written an article about the case, would come light candles with her. But by the 3rd year, no one knocked on her door. Still, she lit 7 small candles, set a store-bought cake on the table, and placed an empty chair across from her. Then she would sit down, take out a blank sheet of paper, and write a few lines, as if Benjamin himself were writing to his mother. The handwriting was messy, with deliberate misspellings, and the letters leaned awkwardly, just like when he was first learning to write. In the letter, Benjamin would say he was living somewhere far away, a place with a lake and ducks, that he still missed her, missed the smell of her soap and the noodles she cooked in the evenings. Every time she finished writing, she read it over again, as if it were the first time she'd received news from her son. She kept those letters in a small wooden box under her bed, alongside the photo album, Muffin the stuffed cat, and the pair of socks Benjamin wore on his 3rd birthday. There was a time she believed science could uncover the truth, but after the 1st year brought no progress, she went to see a psychic, a woman recommended by a friend of a friend, who said she once helped a family find their child in Missouri. The woman, dressed in white and wearing a rosary around her neck, said Benjamin was in a dim place, near water, but still alive. Laura gave her money, hoping to receive something more concrete. But a week later, the address the psychic had provided turned out to be nothing more than an abandoned factory on the edge of town. There was nothing there but cold wind and the rustling of wild grass. Laura didn't return. She wasn't angry either. She just felt like she had tossed her last sliver of belief into a place where no echo ever came back. After that, she stopped looking for someone to explain things. She kept only one routine. After each night shift, when the air was still misty, she'd pause outside Garden Mall, look up at the 3rd floor of the parking structure, then turn and head home. Every night, she dreamed the same dream. Benjamin stood far down the corridor of the shopping center, his back to her. Laura called out and walked toward him, but each time she reached to touch his shoulder, he stepped just out of reach. He never turned around, not once. She used to wake in panic after those dreams, but now she was used to them. She had come to understand that sometimes dreams don't lead anywhere, they simply remind you that you still remember. Benjamin was never found. There were no ransom calls, no new evidence. But Laura still woke up each day, went to work, stopped by Garden Mall, wrote birthday letters, and held on to the belief that something, however small, still connected her to her son. No one else searched anymore. No one asked questions. But Laura didn't give up. In the dark, she held on to a small light. And no one could have guessed that faint light was what helped her find the source of her life again. In the summer of 2003, Michael was living in a 7th-floor apartment in a residential neighborhood on the west side of the city. The apartment was small, but fully equipped with pale-coloured walls and a balcony that overlooked a stretch of park lawn where people walked their dogs every morning. He worked for a large construction firm, regularly overseeing suburban development projects, his life busy, and to most eyes, steady. It had been 5 years since Benjamin disappeared. And in all that time, Michael kept telling himself he had to learn how to go on. Not because he had forgotten, but because remembering too much made it impossible to live. He had broken up with Laura after a string of disagreements, stepped away from the investigation, kept clear of the media, and avoided anything connected to Garden Mall. A few years later, he began dating again. The new woman's name was Denise, a painting teacher, gentle, patient, and someone who knew how not to ask too many questions. But every time he walked through the park and saw a little boy kicking a ball, or heard someone call out, "Ben, slow down," he would freeze for a few seconds, as if his body still hadn't accepted that it had no choice but to keep going. That morning, in the construction site's office mailbox, tucked among salary envelopes, supply invoices, and inspection notices, was a small, pale yellow envelope with no sender's name. No recipient address, just Michael, scribbled across the middle in black marker. He opened it while standing near the photocopier. Inside was a torn piece of notebook paper with a single line written in blue ink. "Dad, do you know I miss you?" No signature, nothing else, just one sentence, brief and haunting. Michael's first reaction was anger. He thought someone was playing a prank. It had happened before a few people had sent doctored photos, recordings faked to sound like a child's voice. The police had ruled them all as sick jokes. He crumpled the scrap of paper in his hand, ready to toss it into the trash can next to his desk. But just as his fingers were about to let go, something about the handwriting caught his eye. It didn't look like the old pranks. The handwriting was uneven, poorly aligned. The word "Dad" had first been written as "Dad", then scratched out and rewritten in uppercase letters. Most striking of all, the letter B in "Dad" was written backward. The loop curved on the left instead of the right, and the crossbar was off-center and low. He froze. A backward B, Benjamin had written it exactly like that when he first tried to spell his name. Michael remembered it clearly. That day, Benjamin had grabbed a red marker, pursed his lips in concentration, and scrawled out "B-E-N" before proudly handing it to his father. Michael had laughed and told him to try again, but he'd kept the paper anyway, tucking it into a family file box. That afternoon, Michael came home early and went straight for the box stuffed with old things: ultrasound pictures, hospital bills, Christmas cards from when Benjamin was 2, and stacks of his old doodles. Among them was a wrinkled A4 sheet with the name Ben scrawled across it, the B written backward, just like in the note he had received. His hands trembled slightly. He laid both sheets side by side on the desk, compared every stroke. He couldn't be absolutely sure, but the memory ran too deep for him to ignore the resemblance. That night, Michael skipped dinner. He slid the note into a plastic sleeve and tucked it under his pillow, as if doing so might somehow keep a piece of the truth from slipping away. He didn't tell Denise. She still believed he had let go of the past. But inside Michael's mind, the things he had buried were beginning to stir again. If this was a prank, then why that handwriting? If Benjamin had written it, then why now? Why send it to his workplace? And why say, "I miss you, Dad," instead of, "Where are you?" The question led to a different train of thought. If the boy was still alive, then who was raising him? And who was close enough to know where Michael worked to write like Benjamin and to send the letter just when Michael had started to believe he was okay? There were no answers, but Michael understood this was not something he could ignore. The next morning, he made 3 photocopies of the letter. He locked one in his personal safe, took another to his former lawyer's office to get the receipt date certified, and hid the third behind a picture frame in his bedroom. Not because he feared losing it, but because, for the first time in 5 years, he wasn't sure he understood everything as well as he thought he did. Since receiving the anonymous letter, Michael hadn't seen the world around him the same way. He still showed up to work on time, still had lunch with his co-workers, still went on weekend dates with Denise. But in his mind, a different system had taken over. No meetings, no projects, just a string of unanswered questions. If the letter was real, Benjamin was still alive. But if it wasn't just a cruel prank, then who would know how to write the letter B backward, exactly the way the boy used to write it 5 years ago? Michael couldn't go public with the letter. He had seen firsthand how the media pounced on any lead like a starving animal. Then, when things didn't pan out, they left the people involved stranded in the wake of careless headlines. He wasn't going to let that happen again. Not with Laura. He wasn't sure she could survive another heartbreak. Instead, he started quietly digging. The first step was to retrace old clues, the security footage from the Garden Mall parking lot, where a grey pickup truck was seen leaving around the same time Benjamin disappeared. Back then, the police report noted an unclear license plate, possibly LZC or LZG, but no exact match was found because the footage was too blurry. Michael remembered an old friend, Daniel, who worked as a technician in the traffic camera storage and retrieval division at the Ohio Department of Transportation. He reached out to Daniel, claiming personal curiosity about an old case involving someone he used to know, and asked for help reviewing footage from the parking gate system on June 12, 1998. Daniel replied 3 days later, "I found the video, but yeah, the quality's bad. The plate shows the first 2 characters clearly LZ. The last one could be a C, G, or even an O if there's glare from the light. Nothing certain, but it's a Ford pickup, model year, somewhere between 1990 and 1993. There wasn't much information, but Michael took a screenshot, printed 2 copies, and pinned them to the corkboard in his room. He began checking records of grey Ford pickup trucks registered in the area around Garden Mall during the 3 months before and after the disappearance. The list ran over 100 names, most of which had already been sold or transferred. He wasn't an investigator, nor did he have access to the civilian vehicle registration system, but he knew how to go around the edges. From the list, he picked out truck owners who lived near the city centre or had been cited for speeding violations within 6 months before the incident. One of the names made him stop: Robert Danning. That name wasn't unfamiliar. Robert had been a business partner of Michael's back in 1996 to 1997, supplying construction materials for a joint venture project. A quiet, unfriendly man, he stuck to contracts, but often avoided discussions about unexpected costs. After a minor dispute over an incomplete order, they lost contact. Michael hadn't seen Robert since April 1998. He began digging for Robert's information through old directories and company files. But that small company had shut down shortly afterward. The residential address on file was no longer occupied. The current landlord said Robert moved out without leaving a phone number, shortly after the summer of 1998. No one knew where he'd gone. Michael began to feel something fall into place, a small piece, still blurry, but fitting snugly into a corner of the hazy puzzle forming in his mind. He made a large paper map and pinned it to the bare wall in his room. He marked Garden Mall with a red thumbtack, then added the location of the parking lot camera, Robert's old address, and possible routes leading from the city centre to the suburbs during the time window in question. Every evening after work, he stood in front of the map like a puzzle enthusiast, connecting points with thin strings. One day, he heard from an old acquaintance who worked in judicial support services that a family near the state border had once taken in a child with no documentation, a boy named Ben, born around the early 1990s. Without hesitation, Michael drove more than 3 hours out there, carrying a photo of young Benjamin, heart filled with hope. The boy, Ben, had brown hair, similar skin tone, and a quiet gait that almost made Michael call out the wrong name. But when he spoke to the boy, the child didn't recognize anything. The family raising him confirmed they had adopted him from a legal agency, with paperwork dating back to 1992, before Benjamin was even born. Michael didn't blame them. He thanked them and left, feeling a small weight lifted from his chest, but also as if he'd just burned another shred of hope into the void. On the drive back, he pulled over at a rest stop and sat in the car for a long time. He didn't turn on the lights, didn't switch on the radio. In his mind, one line from the letter kept echoing. "Do you know I miss you, Dad?" He took the letter from his wallet, now laminated, and placed it on the steering wheel, staring at it for a long time. Beneath the faint streetlight, the childlike handwriting was still the same, uneven, off the lines, and the letter B written backward like a secret symbol only 2 people in the world had ever understood. Hope still remained fragile as a thread, but it was enough to keep Michael going. He didn't call Laura, didn't tell anyone, because if he was wrong, he'd rather be the one to bear it alone than let her fall apart again. In March 2006, after nearly 3 years of painstakingly piecing together scraps of data, Michael pulled up at the entrance to Elmbrook, a town that didn't appear on any tourist map. The population barely topped 3,000. There was an old supermarket, a gas station, and a small general store next to the church. According to old financial records Michael had uncovered, this was where Robert Danning had once owned a house, purchased in the spring of 1998, and sold again that August, just weeks after Benjamin went missing. The records noted simply, "Urgent sale, relocating for personal reasons." Nothing overtly suspicious, but the timing and the seller's identity matched too precisely for Michael to chalk it up to coincidence. He parked 3 blocks from the residential area, walking against the sunlight to avoid drawing attention. He stopped in front of a pale blue wooden house, the same address listed in the sale documents. The current owners were an elderly couple. Michael knocked, pretending to be someone looking to buy a home in the neighborhood to settle a relative in recovery. The homeowner, Ellen, greeted him politely. When asked about the previous owner, she tilted her head, trying to recall. "Oh, Mr. Robert, right? He didn't live here long. I remember him because he always wore long-sleeved shirts, even when it was hot. Didn't talk much, but he wasn't any trouble." Michael kept a neutral expression and asked, "Did he live alone?" Ellen nodded, then shook her head. "At first it seemed like it, but about a week in, I saw him with a little boy, 6 or 7 years old. Maybe he called him my nephew. But his voice sounded off. Didn't sound like they were actually related. The boy always looked down at the ground, never spoke to anyone." Michael thanked her and walked away slowly. A soft breeze passed, making him shiver, though the day was warm. A child, around 6 years old, appearing alongside a mysterious man right after Benjamin vanished. He turned into the general store near the church, the only place in town that showed signs of regular activity. The shopkeeper, Maureen, was in her 60s, wore silver chain glasses, and recognized the name Robert after Michael nudged the conversation. "Oh, he used to come in for canned goods, instant noodles and cold medicine for kids. Once, I even saw him yell at the boy really harsh. He shouted, 'Ben, you stay right there.' I remember it clear as day because I thought, who talks to a child like that? The boy was so scared, he backed up into the bread shelf, didn't even look up." Michael swallowed hard. "Are you sure he called the boy Ben?" "Positive," Maureen said firmly. "I heard it with my own ears. Strange thing is, that boy's never been to school. The elementary school's just 2 blocks away. but I never saw his name on any class list. I used to be on the PTA back then, so I remember well. He went on to ask about a pediatrician. Immunization records, everything came back the same. There weren't any. The boy had never been taken to a doctor, never appeared in any system that recorded a child's identity. Maureen stepped behind the counter and pulled out a small tin box. Inside were some old photographs, wedding pictures, shots of the street, a Christmas photo from some year past. One of them made Michael freeze. It was taken in front of the grocery store. Robert Danning stood there in a heavy coat, next to a brown-haired boy whose head tilted slightly to one side, eyes not looking into the lens. I took that one for some customers back in the winter of '98. No one ever came to pick it up, so I kept it for memory's sake, Maureen said. Looking at it now, there's something off about that boy. His eyes, they didn't look like a normal child's. Michael asked if he could take a photo of it, then walked back to his car, closing the door slowly behind him. He laid the photo on the steering wheel and studied the boy's face. The brown hair, the pale skin, the downward glance, all strikingly like Benjamin at age 5. He couldn't be certain, but his chest tightened the way it does when you run into someone deeply familiar and just can't place the name. That night, back in his motel room, he set the photo next to the anonymous letter. Looking at them both, the jagged handwriting and that displaced little face, they felt like two fragments of the same unfinished story. Everything was starting to line up. The pickup truck leaving Garden Mall, Robert Danning vanishing from his old address, a boy named Ben showing up in a quiet town, only to disappear again without a trace. Michael had no proof, no authority to interrogate or search, but he knew with more than just a slim chance that the man hadn't just moved. He'd taken Michael's son with him. The fear wasn't that he was wrong, it was that, if he was right, then what kind of life had Benjamin been living all that time? ChatGPT, Janoi. Fall of Nam, Hai Kong Mot Mot, Apartment Bon Moi Hai. Laura's place hadn't changed a bit. The drawing Benjamin made when he was 5 still hung in the kitchen. The hallway rug was still frayed at the edge. Every evening, Laura came home after her shift at the laundromat, made herself a cup of tea, and sat in the old chair by the window, staring down at the quiet street. It had been 13 years since the disappearance, and 7. Since the last time she spoke to Michael, a conversation that wasn't long, wasn't angry either, just cold and final, like a door closing without needing to be locked. She no longer celebrated Benjamin's birthday. She didn't write letters anymore either. All the rituals that once made her feel like he might still be out there had turned hollow. Faith, even a shred of it, couldn't stand up to the slow erosion of time. That night, it rained. The wind lashed hard against the window frame, each gust punctuated by distant thunder. Laura pulled the blanket over her shoulders, turned off the living room light, and left just a small candle burning on the table. She was used to nights like this, quiet enough to hear the wind seeping through the cracks in the door. Close to midnight, the landline rang. The sound cut through the rain, sharp and cold. She flinched, eyes flicking to the clock. 11:46 p.m. Laura hesitated for a second, then stood up and picked up the receiver. "Hello?" A pause. Then a boy's voice, hoarse, shaky, barely more than a whisper, as if afraid of itself. "Mum, your name is Laura, right?" She gripped the receiver tighter. "Yes. Who is this?" A breath on the other end. I think... I'm Benjamin." There was no thunder then, but the world seemed to stop. The candle in front of Laura flickered, its flame tilting to one side. "What?" Her voice was so soft it was almost inaudible. "I don't remember everything, but there are dreams. A birthday candle shaped like a robot. a stuffed cat named Muffin, and a woman who always said, "Ben, get your coat, sweetie." Every morning, Laura sat down, her hands trembling. The receiver slipped from her shoulder, and she caught it just in time. "My leg. There's a small scar from falling down the stairs when I was 3. The voice on the other end continued, almost breaking. "Is that true, Mom?" Laura couldn't answer right away. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she didn't make a sound. She didn't dare believe it yet. She couldn't deny it either. Is it really you?" Silence. Then, "I'm not sure, but I want to believe it is. My name is Benjamin." Laura steadied herself and asked for more details. He said he was in a small town, a few states away from Ohio, that the man who raised him always claimed to be his uncle, but they didn't look alike, that ever since he learned to read, he'd wondered why his documents had been altered, his birth date scratched out, and that in the past few months, while the man was away more often, he started searching and found an old newspaper article with a photo of him or a child who looked just like him with the name Benjamin Walsh. The call lasted just over 10 minutes, but every one of those minutes etched itself into Laura's heart like the years of waiting had all pressed into a single moment. When the line went dead, Laura sat holding the receiver for a long time. The room was utterly silent, except for the sound of rain falling outside the window. She stared at the dying candle and thought of the 1,000 times she'd imagined this moment, but not once had it ever happened quite like this. After a while, she stood up, washed her face, changed her blouse, then called the nearest police station and asked to be connected to the division handling old missing persons cases. Her voice was unusually calm. "My name is Laura Walsh. I just received a phone call from someone claiming to be my son, who's been missing since 1998. The dispatcher asked her to hold while the call was transferred. Laura listened to the clicking of the line, then the rain again. After the call ended, she picked up her cell phone, the one that had stayed silent for so many years, and typed in a number she had once deleted, then remembered, then deleted again. This time, the ringing came through. Once, twice. "Michael here." His voice was the same husky, flat. Laura took a breath, then said in a near whisper, "I think Benjamin just called me." There was no response for a few seconds. Then, "Are you sure?" "I'm not, but I believe it. For the first time in 13 years, I really believe it." Michael didn't say anything else, but the sound on the line changed. She heard a chair scrape, a deep breath, and then a short reply. "Tell me everything from the beginning," Laura told him. Slowly, word by word, as if saying it too fast would make it all disappear. Their conversation wasn't long, but it didn't need to be. There was something in the silence between them that told Laura he believed it too. Outside, the rain kept falling on the roof. But in the small room, Laura sat upright, her hand resting on an old photo of Benjamin. And for the first time in years, her eyes held not just sorrow, but readiness. The town of McAllen sat near the Pennsylvania state line, surrounded by low woods and an old highway that barely saw traffic. No one came here unless they had to, and no one left unless they were made to. Benjamin Carter, 18 years old, lived in a one-story wooden house on the edge of town with the man everyone called Uncle Robert. He didn't go to school, had no ID, no bank account. Most days he did odd jobs, fixing pipes, hauling firewood, sometimes helping unload goods for a small grocery store near the train depot. The money he earned, if it was a decent amount, was kept safe by Uncle. If it was little, he got called a freeloader. Their house sat nearly a kilometer from the nearest neighbor. The backyard was a mess of wooden crates and rusted metal. Inside, Benjamin's room held only a bed and a small dresser. No mirror. "Mirrors make you weak," Robert said. Benjamin couldn't clearly remember anything before he was 6. His earliest memories floated like mist-smelling toast in the morning, hearing a woman softly sing something about sunshine, the warm grip of a hand around his wrist. But whenever he asked, "Did I used to live somewhere else?" Robert would blow up. "You don't have any other mother but me. You're Benjamin Carter. I'm the only one who raised you. You should be grateful." At first, Benjamin believed him. Kids don't have a reason not to believe the adults who feed and clothe them, who keep them warm through long winters. But by the time he turned 10, things started to feel off. Other kids went to school. They had birthdays. Their names showed up on library lists. But Benjamin, no medical records, no birth certificate. No one knew who his mother was. Anytime he got close to someone, a temp worker, an old woman who lived nearby, Robert would suddenly decide it was time to move house. They'd moved at least 6 times in 12 years. No one had time to remember Benjamin's name, and he never had any pictures. Robert always called him Ben, sometimes Kid or worse. But Benjamin still remembered the way someone, maybe in a dream, had once said, "Ben, grab your coat, sweetheart." Not kid, not boy. One humid August night, Robert fell asleep early, drunk. Benjamin couldn't sleep. The sound of crickets drifted through the half-open window. He sat up, stepped quietly out into the hallway, and made his way to the small storage room at the end. That room was usually locked, but tonight, the door was left ajar. In the attic above, there was the smell of damp wood and old ashes. In a corner, a worn cardboard box was hidden beneath the floorboards. Benjamin lifted the boards, opened the box, and found some yellowed papers inside among them, a crumpled birth certificate. The writing nearly faded. Benjamin Walker, born June 12, 1993. Mother, Laura Walker. He read the line over and over. Walker, not Carter. Below the name, there was a faint pen mark, like someone had once tried to scratch it out. Inside the box, there was also a torn newspaper clipping with a photo of a brown-haired boy. He stood in front of a shopping mall, eyes looking straight into the camera. Below the photo, the caption read, "Benjamin Walker, missing since June 1998, Ohio." His heart pounded. He had never seen his name written like that before. But the face in the photo, though younger, softer, looked so much like him that Benjamin stood frozen for a long time, barely breathing. The next morning, Robert didn't say a word. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe he'd forgotten to lock the door. But Benjamin was no longer the boy who believed everything his uncle told him. That day, he stopped by the town's general store. At the information counter, there was an old bulletin board covered in flyers from years past. One of them was a missing person notice from the Missing Kids organization. In the bottom corner of the flyer, it read, "If you have any information, call 1-800. Benjamin copied the number onto his hand. That night, once Robert was fast asleep, he used the pay phone near the church. His fingers trembled as he dialed each number. A recorded voice came first, then a real person answered, "Missing Kids Hotline. How can we help you?" He didn't know where to begin. He just said, "I'm not sure who I am, but I don't think I'm Ben Carter. I found a birth certificate. My real name might be Benjamin Walker. My mom might be Laura." The person on the line asked questions. He told them about the song, "You Are My Sunshine," someone used to sing to him before bed. About a stuffed cat named Muffin. About the warm coat with a faint perfume scent he used to wear on school mornings. The call lasted 15 minutes. At the end, the voice asked, "Are you ready to be helped? To let us connect you with your real family?" Benjamin was silent for a few seconds. Then he answered, "Yes, By the time he hung up, dusk had fallen. The rooftops were glowing red-brown in the sunset. Benjamin stood still for a long while, as if waiting for himself to catch up with what had just happened. He didn't know what came next, but for the first time in his life, what he felt wasn't fear. It was the beginning of the truth. A day after Laura's call, Michael boarded a plane to Pennsylvania. The trip was unannounced and without delay. Federal agents had stepped in after receiving a tip from the missing kids hotline. A team of senior investigators began coordinating with local police. And for the first time in years, all the pieces once scattered, once meaningless, started aligning on their own. Laura arrived half a day after Michael. They met at the county sheriff's office. No one said much. 4 eyes met in silence, as if time had never passed, only stepped aside and waited for them to arrive. Benjamin was being held in a separate area, with a counselor on standby. He didn't fully understand what was happening, only that the door he had just opened seemed to be leading him somewhere familiar, though he couldn't name it. Michael was the first to enter. He didn't introduce himself, didn't give a name, just sat across from the boy, hands clasped, eyes calm but focused. Like a stranger meeting another stranger, but carrying an entire lifetime with him. Do you remember a rainy day when someone pulled your coat up and said, "Hurry up, Ben, you'll be soaked"? Benjamin looked up, slowly nodded. Did you ever hurt your leg needed 7 stitches after falling off the steps into the yard? Benjamin answered, yes. I still have the scar. He rolled up his pant leg and pointed to a faint mark on his left shin. Do you remember what your favorite toy was? A green plastic robot. The head's gone. Michael said nothing. His throat tightened, but his hands stayed where they were, steady. The conversation stopped there. He didn't ask anything more, didn't say who he was. Then it was Laura's turn. She stood outside the room, looking through the two-way glass. Her lips were pressed tight, one hand gripping her coat until it wrinkled. Every step closer felt like another year had passed. And when the police opened the door, she still didn't go in until inside. Benjamin stood up and asked, "Mum?" Just one word. Laura sank into the chair. Her hand trembled, but she stepped forward slowly. There was no crying, no breaking down. Just an embrace, careful, hesitant, then tightening, as if afraid the other might dissolve into thin air. Benjamin reached for her hand, then gently brushed the strands of grey in her hair, like he was searching through the mist of childhood for a memory. He spoke softly, voice unsure, like he feared he might be wrong. Did you ever sing, "You Are My Sunshine" to me when I was falling asleep? Laura gave his hand a gentle squeeze, her eyes reddening, then nodded slowly. Every night. When you fell asleep on the bed, I still sang the last line, even though you couldn't hear it anymore. Benjamin gave a faint, tearful smile, then asked another quiet question, like testing himself. One time, you dropped toast on the floor and still picked it up, cut it in half, and gave me the first piece. Laura let out a laugh, rough from holding back too much. And you scolded me, remember? Dirt's not a seasoning, Mum. Benjamin gave a small nod. The haze in his eyes was gone. All the doubts seemed to find their answer not in a file, not in test results, but in the tiny scraps of everyday life things only a mother would remember, without a single mistake. That night, a DNA test was conducted at the local lab under supervision by Child Protective Services and legal representatives. Samples from Benjamin, Laura, and Michael were sent to 2 separate facilities to prevent any mix-ups. 2 days later, the official results came back. Akilen kvenkilens eges, kilen shaskilens venyolk, shazad shazalek match. Benjamin, was the biological son of Laura and Michael. There was no press conference, no media presence. The police delivered the news privately, in a small meeting room, with lawyers and the lead investigator present. Laura sat in silence. Michael buried his head in his hands, making no attempt to hide the emotion. Benjamin, when he heard the result, didn't cry. He only closed his eyes for a long time. Then asked, "So, who am I really?" Laura stepped closer and laid her hand on his shoulder. "You're Benjamin. You're my son. And your father's name is Michael." Outside, Robert Danning had been arrested without resistance. When the police stormed the cabin where he'd lived with Benjamin, he simply stood up, held out his hands, and quietly said, "I just wanted a child who wouldn't leave me." Only one sentence, but no one present that day ever forgot the look in his eyes. Not anger, not fear. Just the gaze of a man who had been hopeless for a long, long time. The file later revealed things about Robert's past that he had never spoken of, that he once had a young son who died in a car accident, that his wife left without a word afterward, that for many years he lived alone, adrift, and underwent mild psychiatric treatment. Benjamin, the child who wandered into his life at the exact moment he lost everything, became a stand-in for the affection he could no longer build in the real world. He didn't sell the boy, didn't physically abuse him to the point of injury, but neither did he offer a healthy kind of love. He stripped a child of the right to live as himself, the right to be remembered by his real name, and gave him instead the identity of Ben Carter. He offered no further explanation, no excuses, no denials. The charges filed against him included kidnapping, unlawful confinement of a minor, document forgery, and obstruction of justice. He would be facing no less than 30 years in prison. Benjamin did not attend the initial interview. He stayed with Laura at a roadside inn near the lake, where they sat together for a long time without speaking. He watched his mother fall asleep by the window, while he stayed up nearly until dawn, listening to the insects blending into the sound of falling leaves. The man who once called him grandson, son, Ben, no longer took form in his mind, just a shadow now, warped, sorrowful, but no longer able to control him. No one could give back the 13 years that had been lost. But for the first time, Benjamin no longer felt lost in the name Ben Carter. He was Benjamin Walker, and he had been found. A month after the trial, winter had begun to settle over the small town where Laura lived. The wind lashed against the eaves, leaving a thin film of frost on the bedroom window pane, something Benjamin had never grown used to. This wasn't the place he had grown up in. It wasn't the old wooden house, nor was it the memories he'd lost. It was just a new room, lit with warm lamps, furnished with a proper bed and shelves of books, yet so unfamiliar that he lay awake many nights, eyes open until dawn. The trial had concluded after 3 days of closed proceedings, with irrefutable evidence and the testimonies of several witnesses. Robert Danning was sentenced to 35 years in prison with no chance of parole for at least the first 20. The defense attorney offered no objection, and even Robert himself didn't ask for leniency. When the judge delivered the sentence, he sat still, hands resting on his knees, eyes locked on Benjamin, without blinking for even a moment. But Benjamin never looked back. Laura left the courthouse without clutching a single piece of paper, because what mattered most, she already had again. As for Michael, he lingered briefly at the courthouse steps, watching his son walk past him, then quietly followed behind like a father who doesn't need noise to prove he's present. Laura saw it, not through words, but in the way Benjamin still walked slowly down the hallway, the way he opened the cupboard without really needing anything, and how he sometimes glanced over his shoulder as if half expecting the shadow of someone long used to yelling at him. And it was for that very reason that, after a night spent sitting silently beside each other, Laura decided to bring him back to the old apartment, the place she had lived for 13 years, where almost everything remained the same. The slightly faded curtains, the plush cat named Muffin on the shelf, and the little wooden cabinet where Benjamin used to hide candy when he was 4. The room was smaller, older, and a bit drafty because the window frames had warped. But that night, for the first time since coming back, Benjamin slept soundly. He didn't call out anyone's name in his dreams, didn't toss and turn, and didn't bolt upright in the middle of the night to check the lock on the door. Michael didn't live with Laura and their son, but he'd taken a year off from construction work and moved to a town not far from Laura's house. He lived there with his girlfriend, Janice, a quiet woman who often brought over homemade baked goods and never tried to be a stepmother, instead keeping just the right distance so that Benjamin felt safe. Though Michael and Laura were no longer husband and wife, they didn't try to erase each other from their lives. Every weekend, they sat down together to divide the small responsibilities. Who would take Benjamin to the doctor? Who would teach him how to use a bank card? Who would schedule sessions with the therapist? And sometimes they simply shared a quiet dinner without needing to say much. Benjamin's 18th birthday came as gently as a breath. The air was crisp but dry. In the room where Laura had kept everything exactly as it had been 13 years ago, they placed a small cake with 18 slender candles. When the lights were turned off, the candlelight flickered across faces that were both familiar and changed. A mother with more creases around her eyes, a father who spoke less than he used to, a young man with slightly long hair, and a girl of 12. Emilia, standing shyly near the door, holding a folded napkin in her hands, not quite sure whether to sit or just watch. Laura sat on the right, Miguel stood on the left, and Janice stepped back slightly, not intruding, but smiling quietly. Emilia finally came forward, slipping into the seat next to her brother. She didn't say anything, but when Benjamin glanced at her, she gave him a quick, nervous smile and looked away. When Benjamin leaned in to blow out the candles, he didn't close his eyes to make a wish. He just looked at them all, one by one, and said slowly, "I remember when you both used to hold me like this." Laura gently squeezed his hand. Miguel placed his hand softly on his son's shoulder, and Emilia, almost without realizing it, rested her head briefly against Benjamin's arm. Every movement was light, no words added, no comforting, no reassurance. Only the candle flames trembled slightly in the breeze from the cracked open window, as if they, too, had been waiting 13 years to be lit again. Only the candle flames trembled slightly in the breeze from the cracked open window, as if they'd waited 13 years just to be lit in that very moment. There were no guests at the party, no big presents, just a few pastries, a camera Laura had borrowed from a friend to take some pictures of her son, and a quiet tune playing from an old cassette player, "You Are My Sunshine," the tender English version, soft like a whisper. When it ended, Benjamin stepped out onto the balcony to breathe in the early winter air. The voices from his nightmares were gone. In their place were small, returning details, the scent of warm tea, the creak of a door, his mother's old blanket, his father's hand resting on the back of his neck as he bowed his head. All of it no longer questions, but slowly becoming real. He looked down at the street below, where yellow lights bled into the thin mist. Then he turned and saw Laura standing by the window, Michael adjusting a photo frame on the shelf. And he knew family doesn't always come back the way it used to, but it's not lost either. It just takes more time to find its way again, little by little, through silence, through forgiveness, and through candles that had never truly gone out. Benjamin's story isn't just a journey to find a stolen child. It's also a journey to rediscover trust, family, and the things we once believed were lost forever. Even after 13 years in the dark, the small flame inside his mother, Laura, never went out. It burned quietly with hope, with persistence, and with an unconditional love that never faded. What would you do if one day the person you loved most vanished without a trace? Would you have the strength to wait in silence for 13 years, like Laura did? If you have a child, a parent, or someone close to you, don't wait until they're gone to realize how much they mean. Hold them close tonight, really close. And you, yes, you, listening to these words, are you feeling tired today? Is there something weighing on your heart? If there is, give yourself a moment to rest, drink a warm glass of water, and know this: you're not alone. I'm here. I'm listening.